So very warm welcome to the 8th plenary this week during the Lugano Summer School 2020. And the topic of this evening plenary is public-private partnerships and business models for public health. And it's a pleasure to welcome our two speakers of this plenary who are working for Sight and Life, a foundation based in Zurich. So it's Breda Gavin-Smith and Kalpana Beesabathun. Breda is Global Public Health Nutrition Manager at the Foundation, and she holds a master's degree in public health from the University of Liverpool and several postgraduate degrees. Kalpana has the position of Global Lead Technology in Entrepreneurship at the Foundation, has an MBA from Harvard Business School and a Master of Science in Food and Bioprocess Engineering from the University of Illinois in the US. So very warm welcome to the two speakers. We are very much looking forward to your inputs and of course also then to the following discussion with the questions and answers. The floor is yours, Breda.
Great, thank you. Everybody can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. I'm very delighted this evening to be presenting the plenary with my colleague Kalpana. My name is Breda Gavin-Smith, and as has been said already, I'm the Global Public Health Nutrition Manager at Sight and Life Foundation here in Switzerland. And Kalpana is the Global Lead for Technology and Entrepreneurship. And you will be hearing a lot more from Kalpana towards the end of the presentation when she's going to be talking about the social business models. So I've spent most of my 20-year career working in different types of partnerships with the aim of trying to bring people together in the auspices of improving nutrition. Before we start into the presentation, I want to just take a few moments to tell you a little bit about Sight and Life and what we do. Sight and Life's story started in 1986. At a time when famine struck the inhabitants of Ethiopia. Many of you may recall this, claiming hundreds of lives and leaving millions more destitute. Sight and Life was created at the time as a task force that aimed to address vitamin A deficiency. Over time, we have systematically broadened our work from humanitarian relief to addressing malnutrition now in all its forms. Today, Sight and Life has become an independent, well-respected Swiss foundation based around knowledge and working across nutrition and food systems. We now have country offices in India, Rwanda, and Ghana. So what do? We like to say that we use science to change the way nutrition is delivered to people who need it most. And we do this in three ways. First, by translating nutrition science into practice and policy in very simplistic ways. Second, we build and support public-private partnerships in nutrition, which I will be talking to you about at the beginning of this presentation. And lastly, we develop viable business models. And anyone who has never heard of business models will not be able to say that at the end of today, because Kalpana is an expert in this area and will hopefully convince you of the importance of using business models for public health nutrition. Before we start into the agenda, I just wanted you all to pause for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, a child has died from food deprivation. Many of us will have heard this before, along with many of these other statistics and figures. For example, undernutrition is the cause of around 45% of deaths among children under 5. 1 in 9 people go to bed hungry every night. 20 million people are currently at risk of famine in South Sudan, Somalia, Nigeria, and Yemen. 60% of the world's hungry are women and girls. Around the world, 820 million people do not have enough of the food they need to live an active, healthy life. For a moment, just think about what those figures make you feel. When we work in public health, it's important to look behind the statistics because we hear them every day. Behind these statistics are mothers, daughters, sons, families, and communities. To change these statistics, we need to change the cycle of hunger. So many of you might now ask, well, what's this got to do with partnerships and working and partnering? You'll see from this cycle of hunger that to change it, it involves a lot of different sectors: employment, health, environment, education. All of these sectors need to come together if we're going to stop this cycle of hunger. This is why partnership working is so important, and it's why I get up every day and do the job that I do. So very quickly, just to run to the agenda. First of all, I'm going to talk very quickly around the partnership narrative and how it's evolved from the 1970s. I'm also going to talk about partnerships and the word partnership and how we sometimes misuse it. And then I will look at some elements that are important to success with one example. And then I will hand over to Kalpana, who will talk about business models and why we need business models for public health. Also, you'll see in the Zoom, and many of you are now used to it, there is a chat box. We would really love to hear from you throughout the presentation. And we have a chance at the end to talk to you all and to hopefully answer some of the questions. So please don't be shy. Many of you will have seen this slide. I'm sure when you work in development, you're probably tired of seeing it. You could probably write every word of it in your sleep. What you see is that number 17 is partnering for the goals. So really, partnerships are at the core of delivering this development agenda. So it's very much at the heart of the SDGs. This was not always the case. In the 70s, there was very little engagement between the public and the private sector. In fact, the relationship was often very hostile and there was very little trust. In the 1990s, a change happened, and this chart really nicely showed how this has shifted in those 30 years. So you'll ask, what changed? 3 things: politics, growing frustration and budget, and lastly, a recognition on the determinants of health. During the 90s, there was what we call a freeing and modifying of the markets, which was associated with the Labour government in the UK and also with the Clinton administration in the US. They really firmly believed in bringing the private sector in to complete public sector projects. At the time, there was also an issue around donor budgets for the UN, and they were asked to give a zero growth. So really, there was no funds there, and the private sector were looked at to provide that funding. And lastly, and probably what I think is the most important, was that there was increasing recognition at the time that the determinants of good health are broad and that health challenges are so large that no one sector or organization can solve it alone. We saw this, for example, with vaccines against malaria and also with AIDS, the AIDS virus, excuse me. So very quickly, I'm going to just in the next 3 slides, throw out some terms that we use with partnerships and terms that you hear all the time with partnership working. It's often the case that the word partnerships, I would say in public health, is misused. And many of the relationships we have are in fact just transactional working relationships and not true partnerships. For example, WFP decides that it would like Site and Life to undertake implementation research on M&P usage in Jordan in a refugee camp. That is an example of what we would call a transactional relationship. We're delivering a service, we're taking the risk, and it's a funding relationship where we're getting the money for that relationship. But it's not really a true partnership in the sense that we would think about it. A true partnership would be if that relationship then changed and the WFP decided, actually, we have a similar value here. We're looking at the same thing. We want to improve the lives of children. Let's come together. Let's co-create some activities. Let's share this risk. Let's set out some roles and responsibilities. I mentioned this difference between transactional and real partnerships because actually when you dig deep, there's very few examples of real co-created risk-sharing partnerships out there in public health. Something else in partnerships that's important to think about is your principles. True partnerships have key principles, and I've listed some of them here: diversity, equity, openness, mutual benefit. I'll touch on some of these. For example, equity. which also really leads to respect. Everyone should have an equal voice at the table. And I can tell you that that's often the case in partnerships that I've been in. It's those who pay has a say. And in this type of instance, what you find is that partnership does not become sustainable. You get resentment and there's no respect between the partners. So while funding is important, it's only one part of that partnership, and everyone has an equal role to play and has a different resource to bring. Openness is also really important, particularly if you're engaging with the private sector. Let's be honest about why the private sector is around the table. Let's be open about it. This can lead to trust. If you don't have trust in a partnership, it falls apart. Mutual benefit is another area which leads to commitment. It might sound a bit crude, but everyone needs to benefit somewhere from this partnership. Everyone needs to be getting something for their organization. For example, if you're an NGO that works in vitamin A supplementation, you don't want to sit in a partnership that's goal is about reducing overweight and obesity. So it's important that each partner gets something from the partnership. Lastly, and probably what I think is one of the most important, is courage. Courage leads to breakthrough results when it comes to partnering. Be courageous, work with diverse partners, bring people that are less likely you never thought you would work with into these partnerships, and it creates real change. I'll give you an example. I'm Irish, as you can probably tell from my accent. And about 10 years ago, Ireland became the first country in the world to stop smoking in bars and restaurants and public places. For years before that, we've been talking about it being bad for public health and that we should stop smoking. But when the partnership came together and started to involve employee health and employee unions, everything changed. It became about protecting the health of the employee, not about smoking, not about general public health. And this completely changed the narrative around what they wanted to achieve. And it became the first country, as I said, to stop, I should say, smoking in public places. So that courage, which was difficult at the time, leads to great results. The last slide on partnership terms that we throw around is this categories of partnerships. We generally put partnerships in 3 categories: reactive, adaptive, and transformative. And when everyone sees this slide, the first thing they say is, oh, we want to be transformative. That must be the best one. It's not the case. Each has its role and each is important in different situations. One is not better or worse than the other. But it's important, if you're setting out what the goals of your partnership is, that you understand which category you sit in. Otherwise, you're disappointed at the end of the partnership because you haven't achieved what you wanted to. I'll give you an example of a reactive partnership. WFP wants to distribute its food. So it works with a distributor in South Sudan to distribute to the recipients the food aid. That's an example of a reactive partnership. It's part of the status quo. It's part of what they're already doing. A transformative partnership, and one that's already happening at the moment with WFP and MasterCard, was WFP decided to change how it did its work. It started to move from just food delivery to thinking about how it could make affordable, nutritious food available for its consumer. By working with MasterCard, it was able to make cash available to the consumer so they could make the choice about the foods they consumed. That also then led to WFP working in the area more of demand generation. How do they create demand then for healthier products for these consumers? So they started to look at recipients as consumers and not simply as recipients. That was a transformative partnership that completely changed a business model for WFP. All of these partnerships are useful in different situations. So I'm just going to very quickly now look at some key elements to success that we have found in Sight and Life for partnership working. So as a scientist at heart, I would love to tell you that there is mountains of evidence about how amazing public-private partnerships are with impacting public health. Unfortunately, the reality is that is not the reality. There is very few examples of partnerships that show real impact and show what makes partnerships success. So we're still very much learning in this field. And so it's my wish that we would get better at measuring ourselves when it comes to partnership working. I've just shown this picture because people often say to me, what does partnership look like? Partnership can look different in different places, different situations, depending on the need. whether it's food companies, whether it's women farmers working in a field, whether it's the UN. And often these all come together in one place. The reason I show this is that there's no one picture or unique formula that helps partnerships work better. Just before we look at the elements of success, I wanted to remind you about what the definition of partnerships is. It's bringing together a set of actors for the common goal of improving health of populations based on mutually agreed roles and principles. And all of these are important. I've highlighted goal, improving health, mutually agreed roles and responsibilities. The second thing to think about is, why do you partner? Often it's about leveraging expertise. For example, I'm a public health nutritionist, and I've been asked to sit on a partnership around increasing affordable nutritious food. In that instance, we would need to bring partners in that are expert in distribution of that food, food technology, food science, a consumer marketing person who knows how the consumer thinks. So it's very, very unlikely in a successful partnership that you're going to have all the expertise you need. And that's why we come together. Mutual benefit we spoke about before, and also shared decision making. These are the 4 elements of success in partnerships. I'm just checking the time, yes, we're okay. Shared value, sharing our objectives, sharing our approach, and sharing our outcomes. So I'm going to just focus in a little bit more detail on these 4 elements. The first one is around shared value. This is particularly important when you have a diverse group of people coming together into a room. While the private sector might agree about the societal value, for example, improved micronutrient intake in women of reproductive age, it's really, you have to recognize the fact that a monetary benefit is really important for that private sector. That might be increase in opening up a new market or improving their brand value. But you have to recognize that they have to be open and you have to accept it. This shared value is really important. And if you don't agree this, then again, you don't have that trust and the partnership doesn't come together in the correct way. The second area is around sharing objectives. This is the reason for you being together as a partnership. What do you want to achieve? Why are you coming together? What's important? At this point, it's really important to think about, what are your measures of success? What would success look like? And be realistic. Often we have aspirational goals. For example, I'd love to say I want to end malnutrition in my partnership, or in this case, I've put 20% reduction in stunting in 2 years. This is very unlikely. So what you might be able to say is that you want to improve the nutrition content of the food basket. It might seem straightforward, but this is something that we often forget, because you can get too aspirational sometimes in these partnerships, and that leads to disappointment and also leads to people thinking, why do partnerships work? Shared approach is the third area. This is really around your implementation strategy. Implementation strategy, I should say. What are you going to do? Who's going to do it? By when? How? Who's going to provide service? Who's providing the funding? All of this is also super important to set out how you're going to work. And all of these elements I will show in the example later on at the end of the presentation. Lastly, it's shared outcomes. We all know in the work that we do, measuring the impact of our work is really important. And that's the same with any partnership working. Having short and long-term indicators of success is important, not for your organization, but for that partnership. And this is something we also get wrong. And it's why we don't have good examples of research in partnerships, because we look at it from the organization and not from the partnership perspective. The final key element that I wanted to mention was conflict of interest. This is something that is very close to my heart. In my many years working in the scaling up nutrition movement, I spent a lot of time putting together a governance structure for the movement. I have to be honest and say that many people in public health would say if a private sector was around the table, you immediately should disengage, that it is a conflict in itself. I don't necessarily believe that black and white attitude. I do think you can manage and you can prevent it. There are many ways you can do that, through declarations of interest, sharing goals, roles and responsibility, mutual accountability. Many we've talked about already in this presentation. What I always say is that you need to ask yourself, can we achieve what we want to achieve by not having that private sector partner there? Or do we need them to be there to really achieve what we want to achieve? So if I'm going to be in a partnership where I want to improve access to nutritious foods, it's not going to be a success unless I have a private partner around the table. If you want to find out more information or you're interested in around conflict of interest, then I would say to you to have a look at the Sun Movement guidance, because it's probably the most thoroughly researched one out there. So lastly, I'm just going to take you through an example, keeping in mind those 4 elements of success that we talked about. Obasama. So Obasama is a demand-driven approach to nutrition. And a number of years ago, partners, which included Sight and Life Foundation, DSM, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, GIZ, and SIF at a global level, including the partners at a local level, which was the Association of Ghana Industries, the Ghana Standards Authority, and the World Food Programme at a local level, came together under the shared value and objective of eliminating micronutrient malnutrition among women in Ghana. The aim was to increase the number of affordable, safe, and nutritious fortified foods available in Ghana for women of reproductive age, and importantly, to make them recognizable. So immediately here we had a shared value, which was eliminating malnutrition, and our shared objective, which was increasing the number of affordable, safe food. We can easily measure if we're increasing the number of affordable, safe food. So it was a realistic goal. The approach we took was in 3 different areas. First, rich consumer insights and targeted marketing campaign. We spent quite a bit of time at the beginning of this project doing formative research to really understand women of reproductive age. What did they eat? When did they eat them? What was their attitudes to food? What was their attitude to the family? We found out a lot of key information that enabled us to really target the marketing campaign in what we felt would be much more successful. For example, we found that women in Ghana were not interested in looking after their own health, but they were interested in looking after the health of their family. So they would make decisions for their families, but not themselves. So the marketing campaign centered around, if it's good for you, it's good for your family. So that key nuance, and many of you, of course, are doing the demand generation course in Lugano at the moment, that key nuance made all the difference to the success of the campaign. The second area we looked at, and one close to my heart, is the business-to-business solutions with local food processors. If we don't get SMEs in low middle-income countries coming together for nutrition, then we're not going to win. We are going to fail in improving the access to nutritious food. The majority of people in low middle-income countries get their food from SMEs, and we want to bring them into this whole nutrition debate, but they don't have the capacity, the resources, the food safety techniques, the fortification expertise. So what we did was we brought bigger companies such as DSM in this case into the partnership, and they were able to support around fortification. Sight and Life also brought a food technologist on board who's there full-time in Ghana and supports the food companies. The third area is around regulatory support through the front of pack seal. And so this means that we have this front of pack seal, which means when everyone or a woman sees it, she knows this product's safe, it's nutritious, and it's good for me. And that's owned by the Ghana Standards Authority. So that was the third element, the approach we took. This is just a slide just for your information around what it is, why we chose it, and what makes it different. So lastly, are we having impact? So of course in nutrition, we'd love to be able to say it's improving micronutrient intake, but that wasn't the aim of the project. It was increasing food, fortified food. So the impact we've had is we've developed new business models for companies through engagement with UN agency, which in turn has created a market for their products among the last mile consumer. So what we've done is we've tried to convince SMEs that actually nutrition can be a business opportunity and it can distinguish them from others in the marketplace. We've also created structured demand for Obasama products for the World Food Programme. So now at a country level, the World Food Programme in Ghana buy Obasama label products for recipients because they know it's safe and nutritious. And we've increased the access and availability of safe, nutritious foods for the target consumer. So in conclusion, I've pulled 3 ideas here together around mechanisms for getting the private sector to do right by public health. There's many others, but I've highlighted these 3. If we want the private sector to increase affordable, nutritious foods, formal partners are one way to do that, pulling their ambitions to nutrition. So a little bit like the example I showed you with Obasama, bringing them in, showing them that this can be a business opportunity in a formal partnership, can help to co-create products and services. The second, a bit more controversial, is regulations, following the rules approach. Some people say it works for nutrition, other people say it doesn't. Of course, regulations in food safety is completely accepted. And at the moment, there's been a lot of changes in regulations, particularly in Latin American countries around nutrition, around advertising and marketing to children under a certain age regarding products that are high in fat, salt, and sugar. Lastly, it's around looking at the public sector as a consumer and a customer. The private sector should see that the public sector is actually a customer and will buy these products. For example, school feeding programs, or in the case of Obasama, the World Food Programme is buying those products. So the public sector can also be a business opportunity. So in summary, I'm not saying that working with the private sector is the only way to improve public health goals. It's absolutely not. But it is one way to increase access to better diets, and they have a key role in what we eat. 90% of the food we eat comes from the private sector or coming from markets. So we really don't have a choice if we want to increase access to food. The second is we need more evidence of success of these types of partnerships, and we need evidence to show that they have impact. Thirdly, we need to prevent, manage, and mitigate against conflict of interest, and we need to respect the opinion of all stakeholders. We need to be able to sit in the other partner's shoes and show empathy to their organization's goals. Lastly, we need to incentivize the private sector to positively engage and also disincentivize for those who are having negative nutrition outcomes. And I will leave you with this quote before I hand you over to Kalpana, which is, alone we can do little, together we can do so much. Kalpana, I'll stop sharing and then hopefully you can start sharing.
Great, thank you, Breda. Hello, good evening, good morning to everyone. You've just seen how the Obasama partnership developed. Maybe I should minimize. Yeah, there you go. So you've just seen how the Obasama partnership developed a successful business model. So we now will spend some time to explore this concept of a business model for public health and decode it a bit more. My name is Kalpana Beesabathun. I'm dialing in from Bangalore, India today. My background is in agricultural and food engineering and business. And for 15 years, I've worked both in the public and the private sector on most of the continents. And of those 15, I've spent over a decade advancing business models for public health in low and middle income countries as a researcher, investor, and a practitioner. So today I will cover 3 topics. What is a business model? Why do we need business models for public health? And share with you some examples, the 5 popular archetypes of business models that you can find in public health. Now, there are many definitions on business models. And as an investor, I found these 2 simple quotes here that can explain very easily to a layperson or a common person. So business models are at heart stories that explain how enterprises work. And a much longer definition is that it's a model that describes the rationale of how an organization creates, delivers, and captures value in economic, social, cultural, environmental, or other contexts. And today, why are we talking about business models for public health? In this world, over 4 billion people carry the burden of a poverty penalty, and they're forced to pay more for lower quality basic public health goods and services. And this is because there are many market inefficiencies, both in production and distribution, but also there are massive institutional voids that you would find, massive institutional voids that you would find with low-income groups. And only a very small fraction of these low-income groups can benefit from government or humanitarian services, which are often plagued with either piecemeal or inadequate funding for programs and projects. And this large group of low-income and poor population is often referred to as the base of the pyramid, or BOP. And the BOP represents a $5 trillion market value and models that tap its markets can improve the quality of life for the poor. Now, there are many challenges that the base of the pyramid or the BOP faces. First, there is an inability for those earning more than $1 a day to pay for high quality products and services. So they can afford higher quality products and services, but what they access in their vicinity are usually of very poor quality. Second, the prices of public health goods and services at the BOP are either inflated, and also you'll find that the counterfeits are rampant. Third, the BOP struggles with erratic cash flow. The fourth point is that the public health facilities are quite difficult to reach, and they are often underfunded, understaffed, and understocked. And lastly, grant-funded humanitarian and community projects have limited reach or coverage and finite intervention periods. So there are many enterprises at the base of the pyramid that have addressed these issues, and they use sound business methods with the purpose to make public health goods available, affordable, with assured quality. And that's why we're talking about their business models for public health services. So the next question that comes to our mind is that who are these enterprises? These enterprises are both not-for-profit as well as for-profit organizations while they're functioning like a business. And they have an aim to achieve the twin drivers of both social impact and financial viability. There is a regular sustainable revenue stream that's generated from activities related to its social mission. And these enterprises are often called as social enterprises. What you see here is the social enterprise continuum. When we move from right to left, the first kind of a social enterprise is a mission-driven for-profit entity. And right in the middle is a not-for-profit company where it has revenue and can make profits, but all of those profits are reinvested back into its operations. And the third kind is a not-for-profit company, it's a not-for-profit organization or an NGO with primarily self-sustaining market revenues, and any gaps it has in costs while executing the business model, they are funded through grants. And from our work with partners in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, I will now show you 5 types of these business models that benefit the base of the pyramid. The first type is called a social franchising model. At the core of this model is a health clinic or a pharmacy. And the franchisor, the social enterprise, could be any of the 3 legal entities that we just talked about. That is, it could be a for-profit company, it could be an NGO, or a hybrid. And the franchisor's role is to provide training and supplies and monitor or mentor the franchisee clinic or the pharmacy. Some of these franchisee clinics have community health workers to be able to reach rural and remote communities that do not have access to any healthcare facilities. And these are agents that can also create awareness about health. And the most vulnerable patients who can't afford treatment, they often get vouchers for treatment at the clinic at subsidized rates. Now, for this model to be viable, they should have a very large portfolio of products so that even if they can't make higher margins in some of the products, they can still make some profits out of other popular ones, such as, for example, solar lamps, sanitary napkins are quite popular products in some of these models. And the role of the franchisor is to ensure that they can bargain well with the suppliers and procure these products at affordable prices. The photos that you see on this slide are from social marketing company in Bangladesh. They have about 12,000 pharmacies, franchisee pharmacies with clinics attached to them, and more than 2,500 community health agents. And in the last 3 decades since its inception, social marketing company has not only been financially viable, but they were also able to avert nearly 200 million disability adjusted life years. Now we move on to the second type of business model that you find for public health. It's called the micro-franchising model. Its model is called micro because in the earlier model, the smallest unit that you see there is a clinic or a pharmacy, which is the franchisee. And it's replaced here with an individual entrepreneur and hence micro-franchisee. So micro-franchisees are essentially the community health promoters who sell health and household goods door to door in their communities while also providing basic health counseling. Some of the known micro-franchising models that have reached scale, that is thousands of micro-franchisees are run by NGOs such as BRAC and Living Goods in Bangladesh, Uganda, Kenya, and a few other countries in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And the model has self-sustaining revenues at the community level and at the branch office level, while the head office costs are typically funded through grants. And the bag that you see here that the micro-franchisee from BRAC is carrying is actually even more magical than the bag of Santa Claus. And you'll see why with this picture. It's filled with products related to healthy living and increased productivity, such as treatments for malaria, diarrhea, pneumonia, soap, feminine hygiene items, solar lanterns, high efficiency cook stoves, and more. Yeah. And all of the paraphernalia that they carry helps them become better health entrepreneurs and trusted health champions in their communities. They have a branded bag, and they sometimes have branded clothing, especially the Living Goods model in Uganda and Kenya, because the brand gives them legitimacy when they visit households. Let's now move to the third model. The third model that's commonly seen is called the pay-per-use model. And here customers from the BOP typically pay for each use of a service or a product instead of actually owning the product or the service. And there are three key elements for this model to be successful. First, the customers pay as they have cash available, or they may have a subscription plan for a set quantity of services or products, which is great for the BOP, especially because they have erratic cash flows and incomes. Yeah. The second is this group infrastructure, which is provided not for individuals, not for households, but for a very large aggregation, say, for example, for an entire village. And by doing so, it can increase higher efficiency, but also lower the cost of running each asset. And the local management at the village level, they provide day-to-day operation support and help. And the third element is that there's always a third-party administration, which could be an external entrepreneur. And the external entrepreneur could be an individual from the village, or it could be a firm or a local NGO in the village, or a village consortium. They're responsible for running the unit as a business, and they undertake to organize and provide the service. For example, on this slide, the photo on the left is a very common scene that you see at the base of the pyramid in India and elsewhere, where clean drinking water is a luxury. So you have these vehicles that bring drinking water to the communities, and one may or may not get the required amount of water while also paying a high price for collecting this drinking water. And the photo on the right is the community water filtration plant that has disrupted the model where you have to depend on vehicles. Yeah? And this community water filtration plant is run by an NGO in India called the Bairaju Foundation. What they do is they sell purified water at about half the price of any household activated carbon water filter, and at about a third of the cost of boiled water. And water is sold in 12-liter containers for as little as 3 US cents. And that's enough to cover the daily clean water needs of an average household. And customers buy the water when they have the available cash. And it's always running throughout the year. Another example of a pay-per-use model is the solar cold storage for perishables, fruits and vegetables. The photos you see here are from our partner in Kenya, Solar Freeze. So the farmer pays as little as 10 US cents per crate of fruits or vegetables per day, and that can extend the shelf life period of the perishable by 3 to 5 times, depending on the produce. Yeah. And to be financially viable and make it a lucrative proposition for the smallholder farmer in Kenya, Solar Freeze has tried to manage its costs really well. They've integrated mobile technology and temperature sensors in these solar storage units, so that they can monitor remotely, maintain the supply chain, but also have mobile payments from farmers. So as a result, they were able to reduce a lot of the back-end manpower costs while also saving time. And in this particular model, Solar Freeze was able to become viable with 1 unit in just 18 months, which is quite a rarity for social enterprises. Now, the fourth type of business model that we would like to discuss today is the network orchestrator model. Here, the social enterprise does not own any asset. Demand is created for a public health good or service, and then it's matched with supply. And the social entrepreneur's only role is to orchestrate this network of suppliers and create demand from communities and households. The example you see here was from one of our partners in Malawi. It's an NGO called MIVE. And MIVE is addressing two social challenges in Malawi through cook stove distribution and production. It's the problem of deforestation because there is widespread use of firewood in Malawi and the indoor air pollution caused by the burning of the firewood. And two important features for this model is to be that MIVE is very good at rural marketing, especially in community radio and door-to-door village campaigns on the demand side, so that consumers can understand the benefits of using a cook stove and their ability to aggregate production groups on the supply sides and train these production groups to make very high quality cook stoves. And finally, the last model for today's presentation is the hub and spoke model. And it refers to a distribution method in which a centralized hub exists and everything either originates in the hub or is sent to the hub for distribution to consumers. And from the hub, the goods travel outward to smaller locations that is either owned by the hub or franchised by the company. And they're called spokes. Spokes where further processing is done for the good or the service and then distribution from there onwards. Yeah. Now here, what we see is a very successful, again, example from Malawi again, the concept of the egg hub. And in Malawi, where malnutrition rates are very severe, and we know from a lot of clinical trials that eggs as the nature's best food have the potential to solve nutrient deficiencies. So in Malawi, eggs are scarce and 8 to 10 times more expensive than cereals. And this is because there is very low supply of eggs, and that's related to inefficiencies in backyard production. So the entrepreneur here from Lindsay Mill has improved the supply by organizing smallholder farmers into groups and moving them from backyard production to semi-commercial farming. And what the hub does here is provides an input package, which includes feed, chick, technical, and veterinary assistance to the aggregated groups of smallholder farmers. And these farmers are trained in best practices for farm management, biosecurity, and business skills so that they can run the farm as a business and are able to increase the egg supply. And as of this year, the Egg Hub managed to produce 12 million additional eggs per year, and which is 2 times more than the eggs that are available in these communities. And the smallholder farmers are able to make 3 times more income than what they were used to getting before they joined the hub. And as supply increases, the prices of the eggs came down, and the eggs are now 20% cheaper than before in these communities. So some concluding remarks for business models in public health. So for commercial investors who are interested in social enterprises, they will need generous amounts of patience and a willingness to tolerate some unpredictability in business models for public health. Because working at the base of the pyramid is very tough, and financial returns would be lower than what a commercial investor could find in developed markets. But there will definitely be robust social returns as these social enterprises are able to address the massive social challenges present in low-income markets. And for donors who are looking for models of sustainability, working with these social enterprises, initially they'll be smaller in scale, can help them build and can help build capacity in these enterprises because they use the best practices in business. They have to constantly watch for their cost structure, these social enterprises, which means that capacity building becomes a luxury. So a grant or soft funding from a donor could support social enterprises in building the capacity and scale. And the third stakeholder, the government, governments could provide infrastructure that social enterprises could leverage. For example, governments organize a lot of self-help group federations and cooperatives. And that could be an area where a social entrepreneur could find consumers or suppliers. And further, the government could create and set standards so that the rampant counterfeits that you find at the base of the pyramid don't compete with the good products and services that come out of these social enterprises. And finally, anyone could launch a business model in public health. It could be practitioners from NGOs or the private sector or the public sector. And having a business model approach for your project or program with a focus on addressing public health challenges could reduce your dependency on donor funding and further ensure that there is sustainability for the product or the service beyond the initial funding you provide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Breda and Kalpana, for your very interesting presentations. And I have a look on the time, so we are already quite advanced with our timetable. So I will skip my question because I see that there are already 3 questions in the Q&A section. So I would like to hand over to my colleague Maximilian and to pose the questions.
Thank you, Axel. We have a question from Martina Frank. Where do you draw the lines between partnerships with companies that through their own products, for example, highly processed junk food, actually put population at risk for healthy nutrition, yet want to partner with your NGO to further nutrition and decrease malnutrition? In other words, what is your position about such partnerships and health outcomes conflict as well as the credibility of the NGO?
So I get, is that for me?
I think it is it's directed to you.
So
yes.
So it's a good question, and it's a question that we always get. I think first I would say that we need to think about what we talked about, the shared value and the goals. So it would be very unlikely that you'd come up with a shared goal for an organization, for example, that's making junk food, to be part of a partnership if you're working to improve nutrition. What I would say is that often in nutrition and public health, we think about the private sector as the big multinational companies. And actually, this is not the case. We need to start to think about private sector in a much more broader way, in looking at small to medium-sized companies, technology companies. The private sector is not just big MNC food companies. So I think we need to be, I guess, more open to working with different partners who could help. For example, there's a lot of work going on with technology companies and nutrition and so forth. I would say that in that instance around, should you work with a junk food company if you're improving health, then obviously you have a process that you need to go through around sharing your goals, your objective, how you're going to do it. And if there's conflicts in that, it will come up in that process. And it's very unlikely that you would work with a junk food company. And certainly from Site and Life perspective, we wouldn't be working with, with that kind of company in the nature of a project that's about improving affordable, nutritious foods.
Okay, thank you very much.
Moving to the next question from Mike Upio. What is the place of the community in the public-private partnerships? Apart from being a recipient of the interventions from the public-private partnerships, what role can the community play? How can we involve the community in the public-private partnerships? In getting them involved, how to deal with information asymmetry, especially from private sector?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, that's a really excellent question as well. And again, one that's close to our heart at Site and Life, because we really try and ensure that we have equal representation. And I didn't get a chance to talk about every aspect of public-private partnerships today. I will do tomorrow a bit more in the lecture in the morning. But equal representation and everyone having a voice at the table is really important. And I think traditionally there's been an approach that is about who's coming in with the funds and who they take as partners and so forth. And that's definitely starting to change, and bringing local representation and local groups in is really important. Civil society have a huge part in this. And I would say that in my time at the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, the civil society were probably the strongest network within that multi-stakeholder platform and had the strongest voice at a country level. And that's what you need. You need your civil society organizations at a country level to be engaging in these conversations of nutrition. And thankfully, the Sun movement has enabled the civil society to have a much bigger voice. I think, unfortunately, if you look at programs we talk about Obasama, we didn't have necessarily women of reproductive age sitting around the table, but what we did do was we undertook a lot of formative consumer insight research, which enabled us to understand that consumer a little bit more. In fact, that's something that's also missing from a lot of public health projects, is that they don't do that consumer insight research. But I would love to have an offside conversation on this topic around how we engage the recipients more in partnerships, because no doubt that unless we do, none of these partnerships will be sustainable.
Thank you, Breda.
Thank you. We move to another question from an anonymous who said, very engaging presentation. Thank you. My question, in business models, do investors specifically look for market rate of return, or are they usually okay with below market rate returns?
Thank you. That's a very good question, and it's a very let's say point of contention with a lot of investors, and actually it depends on the type of investor you speak with and the country of choice and the business model. If the business model address much lower strata of the socioeconomic group at the base of the pyramid, then the investors look for less than market-based returns. But if you're looking at, say, more at the upper end of the socioeconomic classification at the base of the pyramid, then the investors look for getting at least a minimum of the market-based returns. But then going forward, more than the return value itself, when we talk to investors, you need to set the expectations of the time it takes to build a model in these inefficient markets, and convince them that you need a longer time period to pay back. And typically for public health related business models, it takes anywhere between 5 to 7 years for the model to break even at a smaller scale.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kalpana. I think the next question is also directed to you, Max.
How much time generally takes to establish any social business model in the community?
Oh, that's a very good question. Thank you. And it also, again, depends. Let's say for an existing product, say, for example, a water filtration plant exists, but it's just not available for at the base of the pyramid. Moving the model to the community would require some level of formative research or initial assessment of what it takes. Yeah? And that would take at least a year to figure out how you would launch a business model. And once you spend that 1 year trying to understand and start with the minimum, what we call as a minimum viable unit, that is the smallest unit that you can run or operate, to understand what the challenges you would find before you try to commit to a larger or a complete business case or a business plan for the product or the service. For example, in the examples that we saw, a minimum viable unit for the social franchising model is 1 clinic or 1 pharmacy with a clinic. For water purification, it is just 1 plant. Yeah? For the solar storage unit, just run 1 unit to understand what the challenges are, and then you can figure out how to scale and take it forward.
Thank you.
We have a question from Erin Fagerholm. What strategies can aid partnerships to find a balance in setting both transformative and realistic goals?
In relation to partnerships, was that Maximilian?
Yes, in relation to partnerships.
Okay, great. Thanks, Erin, for that question. I think we don't need to sometimes get ourselves caught up in always being transformative and setting up transformative partnerships. I think what we found inside in life was it was often those transactional relationships. So that initial work with a partner where you get to know each other, you start to trust each other, but you're not in a full partnership. That time put into those relationships often leads to really much more developed partnerships that then lead to something bigger, and that can result in more transformative partnerships. So I think for many people out there, and certainly from my experience, many of the relationships that I've had have always started as a transactional relationship, a discussion with partners, and we are doing some research or implementing some work on the ground, and then that leads to something else, and it leads to developing relationships and building trust and so forth. And actually, the best partnerships are built on those that have started as transactional and then lead into kind of bigger, more trustworthy partnerships. So it's not something that happens overnight. I think that One of the greatest challenges that we often have in nutrition funded projects, is that we expect results very quickly in these partnerships. And in fact, we need to be able to be a bit more patient and to give it a bit more time. I think you probably have to give a minimum of 5 to 6 years in many of these partnerships to really show impact.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And
Thank
unfortunately,
you.
budget doesn't always work to that time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Breda.
We have still time for the last question of today from Gianna Gale Amu. Where do the people beneficiaries factor in the business model, or are they just considered as passive consumers?
Oh, that's a very good question. And it's not just for business model. I think this, the example or the principle that we follow here in life is the consumer is at the center, whether it is for a project, a program, or for a business model. If we don't understand the pain points or what the gains that a consumer is looking for in a product or a service, the business model would certainly fail. And many times when we talk to social enterprises in different countries, they only focus mostly on the product or the process of getting the product to the customer. And they often forget that unless you understand very clearly what the customer or the consumer wants, you will not be able to get to the product. And a significant part of our work actually goes into trying to convince not only the social enterprises, but also the investors and donors. You need to first start with the consumer, understand what the consumers want, invest in consumer insights and consumer research, and then from there you can develop your business model.
Thank you very much. And please allow me a last question, which was posted not in the Q&A, but in the chat function from an old colleague from Tajikistan, Muazzama Jamalova. And she is asking, which mechanisms exist to address possible corruption in PPPs?
Yes, thank you for that question. I mean, there's a lot of mechanisms out there. I think we spoke about the Sun Movement governance procedures. Many big organizations have mechanisms and procedures in place, and I'm happy to share some of those after this if people are interested. But ensuring that you declare your interest is always the first basic thing around preventing corruption. What's the interest of the people, what their goals, then you move on to what your goals are, what your shared interests. So I think if you were to ask honestly to anybody today who's working in a partnership, who went through a procedure around declaring their interests, spending time on sharing their values, looking at what the goals are of the organization, who's going to do what can people bring, I don't think many people would put their hands up. So I think we often rush into these partnerships and then we blame the partnership rather than going back and thinking about that we didn't undertake a process before we undertook that partnership. If you undertake a process before undertaking partnerships, all of these issues come up. And that's where I think we tend to fall down. We rush in, there's funding coming from somewhere, we think it's great, we all come together because, you know, this is what we want, this funding, we want something great to happen. And we forget about the fundamentals of who we're partnering with, how we're going to partner, and who's going to do what. And 9 times out of 10, that's why it fails. Okay.
Thank you very much. So we have come to the end. Again, big thanks to Breda and Kalpana for your inputs and also for your answers to the questions which have been posted by our participants. But also a big thank to all those who participated here in this plenary session. And Susan was posting it in the chat, but for all those who are not aware, you can go to the SSPH Plus YouTube channel and you will find the recording of this session and all the prior sessions during this week. So thank you very much to all of you. I wish you a good afternoon, a good night, a good morning, a rest if you can do that. And hopefully we will meet then, most of you also tomorrow morning for our next plenary session. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.